Hi everybody, I hope that you're all doing really well. So today I am back to talk about a book that I have been so excited about ever since I found out that it was coming out, and that is Uproar, Satire, Scandal and Printmakers in Georgian London by Alice Loxton. This is a history of the late 18th century, following the lives of a group of men who were artists but who put their talent and their passion for art into creating satirical caricature prints depicting the news of the day, the various goings on of different politicians and other prominent figures. And basically during the late 18th and early 19th century were really evocative and able to capture this world in a way that was very accessible and engaging, not only for the literate but also the illiterate members of society, providing both news, political opinion, but also a good dose of humour. I was particularly keen to pick this up because one of the modules that I studied during my master's degree was representing women in the 18th century, and each week during that course we would look at a different format, a different outlet for depicting women. And during one of those weeks the satirical print culture of the 18th century was heavily studied, and it was unexpectedly my favourite week. I went on such a massive rabbit hole, particularly of this print from 1796, which was created by probably the most prominent and most well-known of these satirists, which was James Gillray. And I wanted to learn even more about these satirical prints, but unfortunately, as Alice Loxton points out in her book, whilst there have been like academic monographs, and you'll occasionally find the odd coffee table book of the prints of James Gillray, where it's pretty much just the prints that he created, just the images and not really much about the man himself. There hasn't actually been a popular history detailing these printmakers. And it's kind of baffling because this is such an interesting history. Maybe from the outset it seems like a little bit of a niche interest, but I think there are actually a lot of crossovers here. If you are interested in comedy, in satire, particularly comedy that punches up rather than punches down, if you are interested in politics and propaganda, or even if you are interested in scandal, there is something for you in this book. And there might be some people who say, well, why is this very niche 18th century history relevant for today? And the main argument I would have, and I think Alice Loxton would also have, is that a lot of the origins of comedy and satire come from these printmakers and the work that they were doing, that they were very quickly being commissioned to create. No sooner would something be in the news, but the next day there would be a beautifully illustrated satirical print in the local London print shops. It is basically artistic improv. And not only that, but these images have actually stuck in popular consciousness, even if you don't necessarily know where they came from. If you were to ask most people what they think of when they think of the physical attributes of Napoleon, they would probably say that Napoleon was a short man. But actually, if you do any sort of digging into it, Napoleon was actually pretty much an average height for a man in the late 18th, early 19th century. I think around about 5'6", 5'7". So why is it that when you ask people, they think that Napoleon was short? Well, actually, it's because a lot of the caricatures, a lot of the satirical prints that were done of Napoleon by people like James Gillray or Thomas Rowlandson, it depicted him as a short man. Because of course this was pro-British, anti-French propaganda meant to make him look diminutive, and because of his physicality not being so impressive, that was a way to poke fun at him. I will say that is something that you should bear in mind with this book. A lot of comedy within these prints derives from caricature, particularly physical attributes being exaggerated, mocked, made fun of, which is a type of comedy that I don't really appreciate in the modern day, but for some reason 18th century, 19th century, I can kind of like sweep it under the rug. But also when you're talking about the modern relevance of these prints, look no further than The Plum Pudding in Danger, which is another James Gillray cartoon from 1805, which depicts Britain's Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger, as well as Napoleon. Once again, you're seeing Napoleon depicted as a very short man, especially in comparison to William Pitt. This is probably the most famous political cartoon ever, and one that political cartoonists even to this day have replicated and paid tribute to. Here we have Edward MacLachlan's 1983 print, The SDP-pudding in Danger, which depicts Margaret Thatcher, Roy Harris Jenkins and Michael Foot. We also have this one from June 2019 by David Rowe, which was done just before the G20 summit, which I quite enjoy seeing Donald Trump in a high chair. Or even more recently, this one created by Peter Brooks in the Times from February 2021, which depicts the AstraZeneca vaccine as the plum pudding, but as you can see here, it's not being carved up between Boris Johnson and Emmanuel Macron. Boris Johnson has just kept it for himself, and there's nothing left for France. So even if this history is not very well trodden ground, even though a popular audience at large might not know very much about it, it still has lasting legacies and relevance to today. But what about the book itself? of Alice Loxton is being traditionally published here, but she's probably most well known for being what she has referred to as a TikTok historian, where pretty much every day she will be going to a different location, from country houses to cathedrals, and giving her audience like little 1-minute segments about the history behind these places. And you'll see from these videos that she has such a great way of evoking a scene and a setting, and that definitely comes through in here. She pitches this book as wanting it to be a popular history, one that is going to be readable and accessible to the public. And I would say she definitely succeeds at that goal. This is eminently readable, and I think she makes it very engaging and fun. I think you would describe this as being the kind of history, the kind of non-fiction that reads like fiction. And there are even sections where Alice Loxton creates her own dialogue for these different characters and creates her own imagined scenes. Though she does very clearly state that this is her own imagining, it's not necessarily what definitely happened. While the book is packed with lots of scholarly detail, something that will be very noticeable is that there is a casual kind of colloquial language being used here. It's a very jokey book, and there are lots of pop culture references scattered throughout, which is something that I personally do not mind in a book, but I know for some people it might rub them up the wrong way. I actually saw a couple of Goodreads reviews where they said that they found it a little bit childish, and actually what I want to do here is I want to defend this choice, because I don't think it is at all Alice Loxton being like juvenile with her writing. I think this is a very deliberate choice. I would actually argue that Alice Loxton, through having this very evocative writing style that is very atmospheric and almost romantic at some points, description that is very vivid and at some moments almost feels like it's actually a bit of a caricature itself of the 18th century and Georgian society at the time, added in with this kind of cheeky, humorous tone, while also using this to speak a truth to her audience. It feels very clear to me that she is trying to replicate the caricatures, the satirical prints that she is talking about. She is trying to mirror that tone in her writing style. The prints of these very talented men were speaking a truth whilst also being very much exaggerated, depicting various scenarios and scenes of these politicians and famous figures that may not have necessarily happened, but spoke to some sort of truth about these figures, or at least whatever truth they wanted to put forward at the time. And I think that is reflected in the scene setting that Alice Loxton is writing herself, particularly in these moments where she does kind of fictionalise things. She's doing deliberately with intention. At the beginning of this book, she talks about one of the precursors to characters like James Gillray, Thomas Rowlandson, Isaac Cruikshank. She talks about William Hogarth, who was a generation before these men, but who similarly used satire in his artwork. I'm slightly paraphrasing here, but she says, Hogarth's grand aim was to cut through distinctions between the highbrow and the lowbrow of culture. And I think that's exactly what Alice Loxton is trying to do here, taking something that has traditionally just been the knowledge of the highbrow academic and writing about it in such a style that is going to make it accessible, digestible, and just sheer fun for a popular audience, which is exactly what those prints were meant to be in the first place. Kind of like how Shakespeare was originally writing for a mass audience, but through how it has been taught, now the popular notion of Shakespeare is that he's inaccessible, that it's only for an elite to enjoy. You know, William Shakespeare would be horrified if he knew that that's how he's being used today, and I think James Gillray, Thomas Rowlandson, Isaac Cruikshank would also be kind of horrified to know that people don't know about them anymore, and that the only people who ever tend to get to learn about them are academics. Like, I didn't learn about James Gillray until my master's programme. These prints were intended to be viewed and to be enjoyed from the highest people in society to the lowest, to the people who couldn't read, but would be able to instantly recognise these figures and recognise the joke that is being played upon them. These were basically the memes of the late 18th century. And no, I do not think that that is a claim that is misrepresenting what these prints were or reducing them down to something juvenile. This is actually a comparison that Alice Loxton herself makes. She notes that even in popular histories about the Georgian period, for example Ian Mortimer's Time Traveller's Guide to Regency Britain, James Gillray is only mentioned like 1 or 2 times and not in any sort of detail at all, which seems so baffling when these prints are such a great source for understanding humour and scene and setting of the society that he's depicting. But yes, I don't feel like I got out everything that I wanted to say about this, but basically I really enjoyed the process of reading Uproar. The one major criticism that I would have of this book is actually a production detail, and it is the fact that unfortunately, whilst we do have like integrated images of these prints, they're not in colour. I feel like this book would be even more evocative and beautiful if these prints were in full colour. Especially after reading things like Medieval Bodies by Jack Hartnell, I feel like the colour of these prints, the vibrancy, just would add so much. I imagine there may be something to do with like getting the rights for them in colour, or even it just being a bit more expensive to produce that way. You know, if Icon Books ever want to do a full colour version of this book, I would buy it straight away, because I just think it would add so much more to the immersive atmosphere that this book creates. But other than that, I thought this was a brilliant Victorian history. I thought it was so engaging, so funny, and I was so grateful for it for providing more details and context to these figures who I had admired the prints of, but I just didn't know anything about their lives. And I would urge you, even if you don't know if you're really a fan of the 18th century, to please give this a go. I think this would be a really great entryway. So yes, please do let me know if you've read Uproar or if you are interested in reading it. Let me know about any other recommendations you've got for 18th century history. Any thoughts you have, I would love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic, fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.